So for this exit ticket, you're asked the question, which best describes the figure? Is it a rhombus, a rectangle, or a square? Now, again, as mentioned in several instances in the last two lessons, questions like this are not processes of elimination. You're not going to state, well, since it's not a rectangle or a square, it's a rhombus, or since I can show it's not a square and not a rhombus, it's a rectangle. No. Um, I mean, you could use that to eliminate possibilities, but neither is a possible answer. And because of that, you have to, if you're going to say it's a rhombus, I mean, stating that it's not a rectangle or a square lends itself to stating that, but you need to give specific characteristics that make it a rhombus. You can't, I mean, because it could just be a regular old parallelogram that doesn't fit either of these categories. So as I go into these, I need to make sure I explain, one, what I think it is, and two, why. So I have this figure here, and I'm going to identify it. I mean, it is a square. Now, what's my explanation for knowing it's a square? I mean, I look here, I don't have any of these corners showing right angles. That's a characteristic of a square. It's a very typical one. I don't have any indications that the sides of the figure are all congruent to each other. So, I mean, I don't have the typical things that let me know, hey, this is a square. So, how do I know it's a square? Well, that's where the explanation comes in. So I'm going to walk through it. I can see that the diagonals are not only bisecting each other, which is what any parallelogram would do, but they're also congruent. They're both 20 inches in length. Okay? Well, since the diagonals are congruent, that's a characteristic of a rectangle. So that's how I know this is definitely a rectangle. I also see that the diagonals are perpendicular to each other because they do form a right angle right here. Well, if that's the case, then they're also a rhombus. So this figure is also a rhombus. So since it's demonstrating both the characteristics of a rectangle and a rhombus, as well as those for a parallelogram, it's a square. Questions like the next one are what usually throws students off. You have this figure here. Now, clearly, it does not look like a rectangle or a square, so I wouldn't say them. I don't see any indications of right angles at all. So, with that being said, I would say it's definitely not a rectangle or a square. So I would have students say, well, it's a rhombus, and it is, because it's not a rectangle or a square. And out of a 3 or 4 point question, they would get 1 point for correctly identifying what it is, because their reason is not a suitable reason. You don't state it's a rhombus because it's not a rectangle or a square. It could be none of these. Okay? So if you're going to say it's a rhombus, well, what characteristic of a rhombus is being shown here? Well, the characteristic I'm seeing here is found from the fact that I see that all of these angles are congruent. Angle FEC, DEC, DCE, and FCE, they're all congruent. That means that this diagonal is bisecting these two angles C and E, or namely DEF and DCF. It's bisecting two opposite angles. And because of that, that is a characteristic of a rhombus. Diagonal CE bisects the opposite angles FCD and DEF. And because of that, that is a characteristic that is solely rhombus territory. So that is the reason why I could state definitively it's a rhombus, because I don't have, I have that these sides are all parallel to like opposite sides, but I don't have any information that says these are all congruent. I'll have students that will identify this as a rhombus and say because all 4 sides are congruent. You don't have that evidence. You do have evidence that the two opposite angles are bisected, and that's the evidence you have to state it's a rhombus. So that's all I have for now. If you have any further questions, please contact me or your teacher. But until I see you in a live lesson in the future, or you're one of my students that I call you, I'm going to bid you a good day.